Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 131. They ask you how you are, and you just have to say that you're fine, even though you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because he had school tomorrow. He couldn't just go to school tomorrow. What was he supposed to do? Just act like nothing happened? All three of them had been out for the same 2 days. People were bound to pick up on that, right? What was he supposed to say? Just hit him with a family emergency like he used to do with Eraser? The tremor in his hands had yet to fully settle, and he hadn't been able to focus on a damn thing for longer than 15 minutes without finding himself staring off into nothing and contemplating every way in which he had irreparably screwed up everything. People were bound to notice that. Part of him wished that his peers didn't give enough of a shit about him to notice, like his old classmates at Aldera. It was easier to hide things when no one cared enough to ask why he was limping, or why his eyes were so dull and vacant, or why he kept jumping every time a door down the hall slammed shut. Gee, everything was so much easier when no one cared. He'd gotten enough texts from All Might and his classmates that he had run out of minutes on his phone, so he couldn't reply even if he had wanted to. He didn't want to. He didn't want to hear their concern, but he wasn't going to have a choice about that come tomorrow. Well, come later today. At this point, it was 3 a.m. He would have to tell All Might the truth. He had been a part of the whole meeting with his mom plan. He was going to know that something was up when the meeting never happened. He had been planning to tell him the truth anyways. Just because everything went to shit didn't mean that he got a free pass. Izuku groaned quietly and looked up at the ceiling. This was all such a screwed up mess, and he wished he could just sleep through the fallout. He wished he could sleep at all, actually. The 10 hours he had gotten Thursday were coming back to bite him. He didn't want to be here. He wanted to go home. His actual home, not some guest room. He's not sure if being here was better or worse than being in some random foster placement. At least if it was some random family, they would have been prepared to deal with him. They would have expected to give up their space and time. Mike and Eraser didn't ask for this. He was supposed to help people. The last thing he ever wanted was to be a burden for someone else to bear, and now he'd twisted everyone's arm and forced them to help him. He didn't want help. This was such a nightmare. He wished he could sleep and have actual nightmares. Those were far more inviting than this. He's not sure whether he actually slept or if he just laid in bed dozing for a few hours. He was leaning toward the latter because he was still absolutely exhausted when he heard shuffling beyond the door. It sounded like someone was in the kitchen, and a brief glance at the clock told him that it was probably the usual time that they got up to get ready for work. He didn't move, despite knowing that whoever that was making that noise was probably getting breakfast ready. He should help them, or at the very least offer to help. But he was so tired, and every time he saw either of them, white hot guilt forced itself through every chink in his armor. He was a coward, so he stayed put. Eraser had made breakfast today. It made sense. Mike took much longer to get ready. It looked delicious, but it tasted like sand. Though he expected that wasn't due to Eraser's cooking skill, anything would have tasted like trying to eat sand right now. He finished his plate and got ready for school. He waited in the guest room until they called for him, and he sat in the back seat of the car silently. They didn't try to force him to talk, which he was grateful for. When they walked into the school, Mike broke away from them to go to his homeroom, and he followed Eraser to theirs, where he walked in and took his seat at the desk in the front. Was he forcing him to stay here by proxy? Eraser knew that he walked into the room last second most days. They usually walked in at the same time. Was he trying to help somehow? Because this wasn't helping. He quite desperately wanted to go sit in his little hidden alcove and wait until his classmates didn't have enough time to question him before the bell rang. But instead, he walked to his seat and sat down. Ida wasn't even here yet. No one was here yet. They were over 30 minutes early. Eraser was going through some papers at his desk, and Izuku reveled in the awkward silence while he had it, because he knew it wouldn't take long before his classmates started showing up. Midoriya! He heard Uraraka exclaim upon entering the classroom, Ida in tow. Where have you been? I texted you like 1,000,000 times. He did his best not to cringe away as she darted over to him, but given the way that she slowed her pace, he had to assume he didn't do a great job of it. Eraser was still sat at the front of the room, bent over the papers at his desk. He didn't look up at them, but Izuku could tell he wasn't paying attention to the papers at all. Sorry, I know. I we there was a family emergency. He peeked out. Oh, I'm sorry. My pushing probably didn't help. And then the messages stopped going through, so I'm sorry. I was just really worried. Is everyone okay? She asked hesitantly. Ida remained uncharacteristically quiet. Yeah, he shouldn't have said family emergency in front of him. That was insensitive. He could have just said he wasn't feeling well or something. He probably looked tired enough to sell that lie. Yeah, everyone's fine, he dismissed with a cringe. Way to rub it in, Izuku. Aizawa sensei and Yamada sensei were out as well, so you didn't miss too much. Not that you really need to catch up in English, anyways. You guys were out on a mission, right? How'd it go? Uraraka changed the subject and target of the conversation smoothly. Eraser looked up from his desk with a bored expression like usual. Yes, it went fine, he lied. Yeah, he was making other people lie too. He felt sick. That's good, she replied, not letting any disappointment she may or may not have for Eraser's lack of elaboration show. I'm glad you're back, Midoriya. Ida dismissed himself back to his desk with a polite nod. Thanks, Ida. So, we've got 2 days before internship picks are due. I looked through the agencies you highlighted, and I think I'm going to go with Gunhead. Have you narrowed down your massive list? She asked with a playful jab. Not as much as I should have by now, he answered honestly. He'd been doing his best to think about that and not everything else going on around him, but his efforts had largely been in vain. He had no clue what he wanted. Both Mike and Eraser had offered him an internship. Going with Eraser might help build back the pitiful remnants of their partnership. And going with Mike might help him build a persona that wasn't so damn pathetic. But at the same time, he would rather go with literally anyone else. He had invaded their home, and he had to be at one of their jobs already. They needed a corner of their lives away from him. Selfishly, he didn't want to have to deal with them any more than he needed to. He had enough things reminding him of how much he'd messed up. He didn't need to be around the two people who he'd screwed over the most 24/7. Well, what do you want to work on most? That helped me narrow down my choices, Uraraka offered. Yeah, he wanted to slam his head through the desk. The only hero he could think of with a similar quirk who could help him with quirk control was All Might, and, well, he'd helped him about as much as he could at this point. Plus, he didn't offer out internships anyway. He didn't want to sound cocky, but he didn't really feel like he needed to work on hand-to-hand combat like Uraraka, So that ruled out that as well. Public personas seemed to be the only major issue he had right now, so he should probably focus on that. He had gotten a lot of high ranking heroes on his list. He should go through those and see what would be the best fit. That sounds like a good plan. Sometimes you just need to talk it out, right? Uraraka replied. For heaven's sake, he was too tired to keep his mouth shut. He'd said all of that out loud. He was such an a-hole, damn it. He spared a look up to Uraraka, but she still had a pleasant smile on her face, so either she wasn't mad or was a great liar. He averted his gaze quickly and kept his mouth sealed shut. More people had gathered since they had started talking, and he spotted Todoroki making his way to his seat. He nodded at him in greeting, so Izuku nodded back. He was going to be interning with his father, and Izuku didn't envy him. Actually, Endeavor had sent him an offer as well, or at least his agency had. He was the highest ranked hero on his list. Plus, he might be able to keep an eye on Todoroki if he went with him. No, that was an awful idea. Endeavor couldn't teach him a damn thing about public personas when his was so shit to begin with. Well, he could teach him what not to do. His first internship being at such a big agency would look good on paper. He would be able to keep an eye on Todoroki, and he might be able to learn how to deal with the media from Vernon. He'd at least learn how to not deal with the media from Endeavor. Why was he talking himself into this? This was a terrible idea. He was going to do it anyway, wasn't he? Damn it. There wasn't too much time left until class started. Almost everyone was here by now. Thankfully, Uraraka chatting about nothing at him deterred anyone else who may have asked questions about his absence. When the bell rang and everyone was in their seats, Eraser stood up and started class like nothing had changed at all. First and second period passed without much fanfare. Midoriya looked exhausted in English, and Hisashi was glad that he didn't really need to pay attention to the lesson. One less class to catch up on would do him good. He'd been hoping to construct a JSL curriculum for him to follow so that he didn't have to take another class on and be forced into a room with a whole new group of peers to pester him. But that was going to have to wait. Today, he just kept an eye out and let the kid blink far too slowly to not be considered micronapping. It wasn't until third period that anything of note happened. Yamada! Someone burst into the empty teacher's lounge on their break period, damn near shouting, causing them to jump a good few inches off their chair. What? They asked, looking up half concerned and half annoyed to see Yagi staring back at them with a panicked look in his eyes. Sorry, he said, before looking around the room and turning back to them once he'd confirmed it was empty. The meeting. Nedzu said the meeting was canceled, and Midoriya hasn't been in class for the past 2 days. He hasn't been... Nedzu won't tell me anything, and He's fine, Yagi. Hisashi cut him off. He raised his eyebrows and pulled out Sho's chair to sit next to him after that. What do you know? He asked in a very serious and hushed tone. I can't tell you anything more than what Nedzu can. It's an open investigation. Investigation? What's there to investigate? Is he still with his mother? Has she been questioned? Yagi, I can't tell you anything. He cut him off again. The man stared at him for a moment with a desperate, pleading look in his eyes before he dropped his gaze to the floor and ran a hand over his face. He settled his fingers into his hair, holding his head up with his elbow propped on his knee. He looked like he might actually be sick with worry. They wanted to tell him that Midoriya was safe now, actually safe. He was with them, and they weren't going to let anything else happen to him. but he couldn't. He's safe now. I saw to it personally. They did their best to assure him. So he wasn't safe? Yagi surmised, looking at him, begging for any sort of answer. Hizashi couldn't give him that answer, and they knew Yagi knew that, so they just gave him a sad smile and repeated himself. He's safe now. He heard a cracking sound, and both of their attention was brought to Yagi's left hand, which had apparently been holding on to the armrest of Sho's chair far too tightly because it had been completely crushed. They heard him curse in English under his breath before he stood up, swapped Sho's chair out for his own undamaged one, and left the room without another word. Hizashi had expected questions, but he hadn't expected that. It was obvious that Yagi was concerned for the kid, but that was more real emotion than he'd ever seen from the man. He'd come to learn that Yagi and All Might were two very different people, but in either state, his emotions were something he held close to his chest. That was not close to his chest, and Hizashi didn't know what to think about that. They were glad someone in the kid's life actually seemed to give a damn about him because Lord knows he needed that, but why was All Might seemingly so personally invested? He had stayed with Midoriya in the hospital after the USJ, too. Was it guilt? Or did something else happen that day that they didn't know about? Trauma bonding was a hell of a way to build a relationship, but it wasn't exactly healthy. He was scheduled to be working with 1B today for heroics, but they sent a text to Sho to tell him to keep an eye out anyway. They weren't going to let anyone else hurt this kid, not over their dead body. He couldn't imagine All Might would do anything malicious, but he didn't want him pestering the poor kid right now. The day was exhausting. And it was even more exhausting to know that he wouldn't be going home after school finally let out. He had to go back to Mike and Eraser's place and continue to take up their space and time. He did his best to ignore that for the time being as he waited outside the locker room. He had told Ida and Uraraka not to wait up for him, but there was another peer that he needed to speak with before he left. Todoroki? Izuku called for Todoroki's attention as he exited the locker room. He looked up quickly, as if surprised to be addressed, though the emotion didn't register on his face at all. He nodded back at him, greeting him wordlessly. Could I talk to you for a second? He asked, glancing around at their classmates, who were currently paying them no mind as they trickled out of the locker rooms. Yes, I have time. Todoroki confirmed, but made no move to leave the common space they were currently occupying. Izuku nodded his head, indicating that he wanted Todoroki to come with him before he started walking away, sparing a glance over his shoulder to make sure he was following. He brought them off to the side into a mostly disused hallway. It wasn't exactly private, but it was good enough for what he hoped to be a quick conversation. I was thinking about accepting Endeavor's internship offer, he started. Todoroki raised an eyebrow at that. Why? He asked with no intonation. Well, that was a loaded question, one that he wasn't sure whether he should answer truthfully. He's the highest ranked offer I got. Looks good on paper. He responded with a half truth. Okay. Todoroki replied just as flatly as before. Is that all right with you? Izuku clarified the question he actually meant to ask. Todoroki stopped and thought for a moment, which Izuku was glad for. He had worried that he was just going to say that it didn't bother him regardless of whether it did or not. Yes, I don't mind having you around, he decided after a moment. Oh, that was sweet. but it still wasn't really what he was asking. Thanks, that's nice, but meant, is it going to make your father mad? I don't want to cause problems for you. He clarified further. Yes, it will probably make him very angry. Todoroki responded with the tiniest hint of a smirk. And that's okay? He asked tentatively. I'm finally doing what he wants. I doubt he'd do anything to risk me changing my mind, he replied, the slight uptick of his mouth turning into a proper smirk. It was rare that Todoroki emoted at all, much less positively, so Izuku couldn't stop the matching smile that crept across his face. So, have things been better? Since the sports festival, I mean, he asked hesitantly. Better than it would have been if I had lost without using my fire, Todoroki replied, the smile falling from his face. Sorry, he replied reflexively. For what? No, I just mean I wish you didn't have to deal with him at all. Todoroki just shrugged at that. There wasn't anything to be said. He usually sicks his interns on burnin'. He only ever takes them on for publicity's sake, so that if they ever make it big, he can say they got their start with him. I will be working with him, though. Special treatment, he said unenthusiastically. So we probably won't be working together much? I'll see what I can do. I've managed to get soba for dinner 3 days in a row now, just 'cause I asked. Like I said, he doesn't want me changing my mind again. Izuku couldn't help but laugh at that. It was so childish. He was glad Todoroki was still capable of being childish. Plus, the smirk was back on his face, and it was difficult to not let that infectious grin spread. All right, then it's a plan. I'll see you Monday, bright and early, he said with a smile. You'll also see me tomorrow, bright and early, Todoroki pointed out. He wasn't sure whether that was Todoroki trying to make a joke or not, but he laughed anyway. The smile on Todoroki's face told him that it was, in fact, him trying to make a joke, and that only made Izuku laugh more. This felt good. This felt like a purpose. For the last few days, he had been completely lost with no other objective than to make it to the next day and be as unobtrusive as he could, which was a losing battle from the get-go. Getting more intel on the Todoroki family was a concrete goal. It was something he could focus on and work toward that had absolutely nothing to do with him. He was so tired of himself. He had thought about little else besides himself for the past 4 days, and to say he was sick of it would be an understatement. He waved goodbye to Todoroki and set off to work out the next order of business. Hopefully, May was still in the labs. He knew they were open until 4, and he doubted she would leave before then unless she was being kicked out. Mike and Eraser had told him that they didn't leave until around 3:30 anyway, so he had time. When he made his way down to the support course classrooms, he was damn near tempted to give up his spot in the heroics class just to get his hands on these labs. There were tools he didn't even know existed lining the walls, along with the top of the line version of every tool he had ever set eyes on. It was beautiful. He could see May going to town on some sort of metal something with an angle grinder. The awful sound of grinding metal went on for longer than he would have preferred before she finally put the tool down. May, he asked as she pulled out a hammer and started wailing on the piece of sheet metal she had just been grinding down. She gave no sort of hint that she heard a damn thing. That didn't surprise him given the racket she was making. May! He called louder this time. She still had a single-minded focus. A bolt fell off her bench and rolled to a stop at his feet. He figured she'd notice him when she went to pick it up, so he just waited. But instead, she bent down, picked the bolt up off the floor, and continued ignoring him. She had to have seen him, right? Before she started making too much noise to hear his own thoughts over again, he spoke up. May! Third time's the charm. Her focus shot up to him, and she looked surprised for a split second before a grin that would have been off-putting to most spread across her face. 10 million! Did you come for more of my babies? Yes, actually. Well, kinda. I need a favor? He started hesitantly. Ooh, do you need a custom baby? I can do anything. Just give me an outline and 24 hours, she exclaimed, her manic grin only getting wider. I, yes, a custom order, so to speak. But can you keep it between us? He murmured low enough that no one else would be able to hear. Everyone else seemed to give May's workstation a wide berth, which was helpful. The scorch marks on the wall told the story as to why that was the case. May raised an eyebrow at that and looked around them as well, taking in her surroundings for probably the first time in several hours, if Izuku had to guess. Depends on what it is. I'm not risking my access to these labs, she replied, eyes narrowed with suspicion. Nothing crazy. I just need an audio recorder, something small and discreet. He explained as little as possible. She squinted her eyes at him suspiciously again. He's not sure what she was looking for, but after an awkwardly long moment of silence, she seemed to have found it. If something goes wrong, you didn't get it from me. And if something goes right, you owe it all to Meihatsumi Industries. Got it? She decided. Of course, he agreed. Good. I'll have something ready by the end of the day tomorrow, she replied before returning her focus to the poor piece of metal in front of her. Gosh, where was May when he was trying to stake out Block 8? Thank you, he added between hammer strikes. May just waved him off and didn't even look up. All right, that was done. Now all he needed to do was look into what went into building a legal case against someone for child abuse. That sounded like something he shouldn't be doing on either the school's or Eraser's Wi-Fi. He doubted that they would look through his search history at, home, but he really didn't want to get into a conversation about that, and they didn't live too far from the university library. He didn't want to be stuck in that room any longer than he needed to be. If the current state of his life wasn't enough to drive him crazy on its own, then not having gone out for the past 4 nights would have done the trick anyways. He couldn't stand the thought of a 5th night cooped up in that room. Yeah, going to the library sounded pretty nice right about now. When they all got home from school, Midoriya immediately made for his room and shut the door behind himself. Shota held back a sigh and looked up at Hisashi. They had their lips pursed in a way that said they weren't very happy about that either, but there was nothing for it. You still have that grading to do? We could work together out here, they offered. He simply nodded in response and started unpacking his bag onto the dining table. They had just barely gotten themselves settled by the time Midoriya's door opened and he walked out in his street clothes. He nodded at them politely, but didn't say a word before scrambling to the Genkan. Hisashi exchanged a confused look with him, but he stood up quickly when he heard the gentle rustling of the kid putting his shoes on. He rounded the corner just in time to see him stand up from tying his shoes and make his way toward the door. Kid, where are you going? He asked calmly. Midoriya nearly jumped out of his skin in response. The library? He answered, though it sounded more like a question. The university library? He asked to clarify. Yes, sir. Midoriya confirmed. That's on the way home. We could have dropped you off, he pointed out. A guilty look spread across the kid's face at that. I didn't think about that. Sorry. It's not a problem. Do you want me to take you there? He asked, even though he almost certainly knew the answer already. No, no, you don't have to do that. I like walking, he denied quickly. Yep, that was what he expected. Okay, that's fine. Do you have your phone? Yes. It's charged? Y- yes. He didn't know how to say what he needed to say in a way that didn't sound patronizing, but the silence was becoming overbearing and he needed to say something. You can't just. We need. He gave several false starts to a sentence before taking a deep breath. I want you to ask before you go places. If you just leave and we don't know where you went, we will get worried. He did not like the dumbstruck look Midoriya had on his face in response to that. It was like the thought didn't occur to him that they gave a crap at all. He stood there for a moment before sputtering out apologies and asking if it was all right if he went to the library. He told him it was fine as long as he kept his phone by him and was back in time for dinner. Part of him felt silly for imposing rules like that on him. He was a seasoned vigilante, for heaven's sake. He could take a stroll on the nice side of town, but at the same time, he was still a kid. This was all too confusing, and he had no clue what he was doing. Sho? Hizashi called from the dining table. He was standing in the empty Genkon and staring at the closed front door silently. He should probably go back to the table now. He didn't respond, he just walked back and took his seat. They sat in silence for a while before Hizashi spoke up again. Sho, what's the matter? Nothing. Just angry that the kid doesn't understand being treated with basic human decency. He dismissed. They sat in contemplative silence for a few minutes. I think you handled that well. This is a difficult thing to navigate. There's not much of a guidebook on how to care for a child who's been an adult for years, Hizashi said after a while. Of course, they saw right through his dismissal. He scrubbed a hand across his stubble and took in a deep breath before standing again. Coffee? He asked as he walked to the kitchen. He didn't see the disappointed look on Hizashi's face, but he could hear it in their tone. No, I'm good. End of chapter.